Now we're going to discuss about the articulatory mechanism. It's about the structures that contribute to the acoustic properties of consonants and vowels. So first, let us define what articulation is. So the articulation is a process whereby the structures within the vocal tract, such as teeth, tongue, hard palate, soft palate, modify exhaled air to shape specific speech sounds. For examples, da, ga, and your other phonemes. So, technically, moving the articulators to the different locations and positions within the oral cavity modifies traveling through the vocal tract, giving the sound specific characteristics that are recognized as distinctive phonemes. So the vocal tract is a 27-meter long in adult males and is shorter with females and children. So it consists of cavities above the larynx. So basically, the vocal tract is where the sound comes from that we are able to produce in producing speech sounds. Next is the oral cavity. So oral cavity is the point of exit for most speech sounds. And the oral cavity contains important articulators. This includes the teeth, the mandible, the tongue, etc., etc. So here, shape is altered during speech, which is an integral aspect of resonance. So the lips, it is formed of muscles, one of which is the orbicularis oris, and the mucous membranes, granular tissues, and fats, which are all covered by a layer of epithelium. So the underlying tissue of the lips is highly vascular, which gives the characteristic of having a red color known as the vermilion. And it also has numerous muscles insertions, both for elevators and for depressors. Muscles for elevators are levator labii superioris, levator angular oris, zygomaticus major, zygomaticus minor, risorius, and for the depression is depressor anguli oris, depressor labii inferioris, and mentalis. Also, the lips has different mobility, and one of which are pucker, spread out or retraction, elevation, rounding, protrusion, and depression. So the lips are vital for sounds such as ba, and other speech sounds that needs to use the lips in order to modify the sound itself. So next is the mandible. So mandible basically is the lower jaw. So it is attached to the skull by a joint formed between the condylar process and the temporal bone known as the temporomandibular joint, or the TMJ that everyone knows. So for the mobility such as protrusion, retraction, and lateralization to left and to the right. So it also moves in rotary motion, for example, for eating or feeding, and also moves in sync with the lips. So as the lower jaw moves, the lips also moves it. So the next is the teeth. So the teeth is embedded in spaces called the alveoli. So the teeth is not only essential for speaking or for articulating, but also essential for feeding or eating. So basically, the teeth is an immovable articulator. So technically, they do not move, just like how the tongue moves, etc., etc. So next is the hard palate. So the hard palate is a complex bony structure lined with the epithelium. So basically it is the roof of the mouth or the roof of the oral cavity and the floor of the nasal cavity. So it is the barrier for both food and sound waves. So the anterior 3/4 of the hard palate is the where the palatine process of the maxilla, and the posterior 1/4 is the palatine bones of the skull. So next is the soft palate. So earlier we talked about the hard palate. Now the soft palate is the posterior of the hard palate. So it is made up of muscles and soft tissues, and it is also known as the velum. So the velum consists of number of muscles and the flat tendon, and its mobility is elevation, necessary for nasality of the sounds. So the next structure is the tongue. So the tongue is a large muscular structure that occupies the bottom of the oral cavity. So the tongue is made up of many muscles that are intertwined with each other. So it is flexible and it speeds up its movement. And the tongue is used for chewing, swallowing, and of course, speaking. And of all the articulators, the tongue is known as the most active, and it also modifies the shape and resonance characteristics of the oral cavity. So basically, the tongue acts as a valve. So the muscles of the tongue consist of the both intrinsic and extrinsic muscles. Examples of the intrinsic muscles are superior longitudinal, inferior longitudinal, vertical muscles, and transverse muscles. And for the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, here those are the genioglossus, hyoglossus, palatoglossus, and the styloglossus. Next is the pharynx. So the pharynx is important in resonance. It is long, hollow tube made of muscles and connective tissues, and of course mucous lining. So the pharynx runs behind the nasal cavities, oral cavity, and the larynx. So the pharynx is about 12 centimeter long and 4 centimeter wide at top, and so it narrows to 2.5 centimeters in width.
B. Hmm. When we talk, our vocal folds are closed so that the air from our lungs presses between them, which will cause vibrations, and that vibration will turn into sound, and that sound will be called voice consonant sounds. When we simply breathe, our vocal folds are open to allow air into our lungs. The consonants that we produce when our vocal folds are open are called voiceless consonants. In order for us to have a better understanding regarding voice and voiceless consonants, let's try saying words that have voice and voiceless consonants. So, we're going to try saying the word ball and ball. Again, ball and ball. Remember, B is a voice consonant while P is a voiceless consonant. Let's try first ball. And let's put our fingers around our Adam's apple as we notice, or let's notice the difference as we pronounce the first sound of both words. First, ball. One more, ball. Next, Paul. Paul. As you notice, B has greater vibration while P has lesser vibration. You have to remember that your vocal folds vibrate to make all vowels in voice sounds.
Now, you guys might be wondering, what's the essence of all of these in practice? Well, there is what we call spectrogram. A spectrogram is a graph that shows the evolution of the spectrum of a signal over time. This is also a method of identifying frequency, amplitude, and duration, which can help analyze the acoustic characteristics of sounds. There are two elements that can be seen in the spectrogram. First is the frequency, which is on the vertical axis, and time, which is on the horizontal axis. We will now go to the form and patterns of vowels. There are three types of vowels: front, back, and central vowels. When analyzing a spectrogram, it is important to count how many formants are there. For front vowels, there are three formants. This is 1, 2, and 3. You will know if it's a front vowel if formant 1 and formant 2 are wide apart, just like in this picture. Meanwhile, formant 2 and formant 3 are close together, as you can see in this picture. For back vowels, formants 1 and 2 are close together, while formants 2 and 3 are wide apart, just like in this picture. Lastly, central vowels have equally spaced relationship between formants, just like in this picture. As you can see here, they are equally spaced between formants. Now, once you analyze a spectrogram, knowing these rules and formants will allow you to easily determine the specific type of vowel it is. Next are the diphthongs. These are two vowels in one unit which has three parts: on-glide, off-glide, and the steady-state formant. On-glide is the starting point of the first vowel, while the off-glide is the end point of the diphthong. This change in vowel causes the formants to shift in frequency from beginning to end of the sound, also known as formant transitions. We will now analyze the formant patterns of diphthongs. In this case, the diphthong I starts with the typical formants for A. We can see in this illustration that A started in a low frequency and ended in a much higher frequency for the phoneme E, as illustrated in the formant 2. We are now headed to nasals. Nasal stops are produced with a lowered velum and an obstruction within the oral cavity. Sound is resonated in both the oral and nasal cavities but exits only through the nasal cavities. In addition, there is what we call a nasal murmur. These are sounds that exit the nose. When producing nasals, it creates anti-resonances within the vocal tract. These anti-resonances are frequency regions in which the amplitude of the source signal are attenuated because the nasal cavities absorb energy from the sound wave. The effects of these antiformants are more marked in nasal consonants than in nasal or nasalized vowels because consonants are articulated with the complete occlusion of the oral cavity. Nasal formants have frequencies ranging from 250 to 300 Hz. They have low frequencies due to the coupled pharyngeal and nasal cavities, as seen in these illustrations. The phoneme has an antiformant of 1000 Hz. The phoneme has an antiformant of 2000 Hz. And lastly, the phoneme has a frequency of 3000 Hz, as seen in these illustrations. Liquids are characterized by steady-state formants. Speech sounds and are influenced a lot by surrounding vowels. The illustration shows what is being talked about as steady-state formants. The speech sound which is seen on the left, has a tongue position that is pointing back towards the palate. On the other hand, the speech sound acts as a shunt resonator since tongue tip and alveolar ridge come in contact with enough space at the sides of the tongue which allows air to flow around the blockage. This explains as to why the formants are in a very low frequency. Up next is the stops. The major sources of sound for stops are the release of the pressurized air behind the articulator blockage, which creates a complex aperiodic transient sound. Stops result in four acoustic features: silent gap, release burst, voice onset time, and formation transitions. Silent gap is the time during which the articulators are forming the blockage and oral pressure is building up. On the other hand, release burst for phonemes t and d has constriction in front, also known as front cavity, which serves as a high-pass filter. For phonemes k and g, have a larger cavity in front of the constriction, which resonates more strongly to lower frequencies. In this case, shown here is the silent gap, while this one is the released burst. Fricatives is next. This is produced when pressurized air becomes turbulent, resulting in random variations in air pressure. Collision of air against obstacles, such as teeth, increases the amplitude of the noise produced at the constriction. Lastly, the affricates. This is made by quickly combining a stop with a fricative. This has both the acoustic characteristic of a stop and a fricative, since it has a silent gap and a frication noise which follows after the gap. This looks very similar with fricatives, except that affricates are shorter in duration. How will you read this one? The choices are sun, bun, or run. What do you think is the correct answer? The answer is bun. As we have discussed earlier, the phoneme b has a silent gap and a release burst, which is shown in the illustration above. Meanwhile, the back vowel oo has formants 1 and formant 2, which are close together. Notice that the formant 2 and the formant 3 are wide apart. Lastly, the nasal sound n had a frequency ranging from 250 to 300 Hz.